when we went through the degree thing, we as a profession, we had to teach critical thinking, and you have to say to students, well, you've got to find a way of questioning everything, but at the same time you've got to hold on to something in order to actually take any kind of move forward. And I think that balancing act is quite hard. And I've seen students and practitioners not be able to keep that balancing act going and to give up and go and do other things, because the ability to maintain a number of models of reality in your head while you deal with somebody and base your actions on initial outcomes can be quite challenging for people who are convinced there is a right and a wrong answer to the question, because that's not always the case when you deal with complex clinical realities.
FC2O. From chaos to order. From chaos to order. Here we go. From chaos to order. From chaos to order. FC2O.
For anyone in the world of osteopathy, Clive Standen doesn't need any introduction. If he hasn't already influenced your life directly, he will have indirectly through his proactive and prolific role in advancing the status of osteopathy in the UK, New Zealand, and all over the world. If you're not in the world of osteopathy, Clive, as you'll hear, has a fascinating life journey taking him through not only osteopathic training and teaching, but into premiership in 2 of the world's most prodigious osteopathic training facilities. Clive now practices in Auckland in New Zealand, and with his wife Anne, runs holdmyhand.co.nz as a mentoring service for those in the healing arts who are looking for support on their journey. Sit back and enjoy the story of Clive and how he has helped to reshape the world we live in, especially in terms of how complementary and alternative medicines are perceived within the medical landscape. Enjoy the show. Here we go. Well, Clive Standen, welcome to FC2O. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, no, I'm very excited to have you on because, as I think I said in the one of the early emails where we were setting this up, I don't think our paths have crossed much at all over the years. Obviously, I've been very aware of you because of your prominent role in the world of osteopathy. But I missed you at the BSO because I ended up at BCNO as it was then,
yep.
And then you went to New Zealand just as I was coming back from New Zealand because I spent a year out there. So
that's right. I think we crossed for an hour or something here, didn't we?
That's it. Yeah, I think
yep.
so. Yeah. So Clive, why don't we start out? Well, actually, one thing when I was doing a little bit of background research, I noticed that you went to school in Guildford. So I'm in Leatherhead in Surrey. So we're not that far away. In terms of our origins,
yep.
So did you grew up in Surrey?
I grew up near Woking, between Woking and Guildford, and went to Guildford. And the two people I kind of vaguely knew, Bob Willis, who sadly passed away a few weeks ago. I was a couple of years behind him,
right?
But I was in the same class as Jean-Jacques Burnel, who's the bass player with the Stranglers, and we're still in touch.
Oh, right. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Good stuff. So how many were in your class at that time? Because you
it was about 90. The Royal Grammar School was a direct grant school at that stage. It wasn't a public school, a fee-paying school, which it became later.
Yeah.
And just before I arrived in the early 60s, Terry Jones, the Python, had left.
Right.
So,
Yeah,
it's a very old, very old school. I think it goes back to 1550 something.
Wow. And was there anything within your schooling that set you off on the path into osteopathy?
Nothing at all.
No.
Okay. No, I was at a careers exhibition and I think kind of thinking, what am I going to do? And bumped into the team from the BSO. I think it was possibly the first time they'd ever taken a stand at the careers exhibition. I think it was at Earl's Court.
Right.
And I remember talking to Colin Dove and David Lindy, and maybe Tony Pusey was there as well. I think he was a student at the time.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And so, obviously, for people that don't know, BSO is the British School of Osteopathy. I know a lot of our listeners will know straight away what that is, but just for clarity, so did you go straight from school to the BSO?
No, I worked as I worked for the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food in a pathology laboratory for a while.
Oh wow!
And
okay.
then I got a place at the BSO, and I decided that the rules in those days, this shows you how long ago it was that if you had worked for 3 years and supported yourself, if you could show that you've been employed for 3 years, you no longer had to rely on parental contributions to pay or support you when you were a student.
Right.
So I worked for another year. I worked for a charter airline, actually, in their accounts department up in the city.
Okay. Right.
And because I was then living in inner London, I came under the Inner London Education Authority, and they were one of the local authorities that paid fees for students attending the BSO. It was very patchy.
Right.
They were called discretionary fees. So some local authorities around the UK would fund students if they were resident in their area, and others didn't. And it was just pot luck, really. And I remember going to County Hall, just across the river from Palace of Westminster, for an interview, and so I got my fees paid, and I got a kind of cost of living allowance.
Oh well,
it's all really different now, isn't it?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, sounds a good way to do it. Excellent. So what was it at this careers event that really sort of sparked your interest in the osteopathy? Was it just the conversations you had, or?
Yeah, and I think I say often to people now that there are very few professions or careers that involve intellectual rigor and physical skill. There are not many things that you can become involved in that are practical and involve practical activity, taking practical action, as well as having some mental demands. There are plenty of professions, increasingly so, where people are, using their brains but not their hands. And certainly back in the 60s, 70s, there were lots of jobs you could do that were very physical but were very limited in terms of the amount of mental effort required, and that seemed very attractive. I think also many people are drawn to osteopathy by the prospect of not being stuck in a hierarchical situation, and having worked for the Ministry of Agriculture, I knew what it was like to sit at the bottom of a very big mountain or food chain, and I thought that really, I knew I had worked out by then that was something that really didn't appeal to me, that I was not going to enjoy it if I got stuck in something like that, and the prospect of being able to carve out a way of doing things for myself. I think also in those days, patients would tell us that doctors, GPs would say to them, if you go and see an osteopath, you needn't bother coming here again. You can find yourself another doctor.
Oh, wow.
So we were still So I started at the BSO in 74. So it was still very much a kind of sort of beyond the pale kind of existence.
Yeah. And what age were you then? About 20 something, 21?
I'd have been 22 then when I started there. Yeah. So I think this is something I talked to lots of people about in those days, that in order to stick at it in the 50s, 60s, 70s, you had to be a little bit bloody minded and maybe slightly rebellious.
Yeah, for sure.
And opinionated, and certainly Phil Leahy, used to remind me whenever he got the chance that I had made the observation that osteopaths are bloody minded and difficult.
Yeah.
But I think quite a lot of those people had to be that way in order to make things work.
Yeah. So was the training back then? I know that you were involved in transitioning the training to become a degree status training at the BSO in the 90s. But did you have to make any big jumps? I mean, what would you say were the main differences between the kind of training you received in the 70s and how it morphed through into the 90s with the degree recognition?
So when I went to the BSO, it was in 16 Buckingham Gate, which is, I don't know, it's opposite the location of the Wellington Barracks, although back then the Wellington Barracks was still a big kind of hole in the ground after World War II.
Right.
So the new barracks hadn't been built, and we were a few doors along from Buckingham Palace, and it was a small building that the Osteopathic Education Foundation had financed the BSO buying.
Right.
I think that was in the 50s or 60s. Anyway, so Little John was the first principal. He started it. Then it was Webber.
Yeah.
And then it was Colin Dove, and Colin was the principal when I was there.
Right.
And I think in the 70s, just about the time that I was a student, Colin particularly, and maybe the management, but particularly Colin, became aware that osteopathy was never going to be taken seriously because there were a couple of small colleges, three, there was the BSO, the ESO had really just started.
Right.
Around then it had moved down to Maidstone, and BCNO was up in Hampstead, but essentially his analysis was that all that was happening was that they were training enough people to replace the people who were leaving the profession at the end of their careers through retirement or death. And so he identified that a change of scale was needed if osteopathy was ever going to be taken seriously, and that a way to do that was, and to achieve political recognition, was to stop producing graduates with self-approved qualifications.
Right, yes, yeah.
So each of the colleges produced people with a DO, but each of the DOs was approved by the board of the college as being good enough. So there was no
diploma of
external. There was no external. And the fact, and let's leave aside the fact that because they chose to call it a diploma of osteopathy, that caused ongoing difficulties with the US profession.
Yes. Yeah.
Because it seemed to be copying the Doctor of Osteopathy in the States.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Colin set about, they persuaded the board to, he stepped down as principal after about 10 years, I think it was.
Right.
Maybe more. They had increased the length of the course at the BSO from 3 years to 4 years. Principally or primarily under the direction and management of Colin of Audrey Smith.
Yes. Yeah.
And so 74, June 74 was the graduation of the first group of four-year students.
Okay.
That was people like Tony Pusey. I forget who else was in that year.
Right. Yeah.
And they kind of realised fairly soon that was not going to produce a magical change in the nature of graduates. It improved the teaching program, the curriculum. But what they wanted was to get objective external accreditation by somebody.
Right.
And so Colin stepped down. They brought in a new principal who was the first non-osteopath to be principal of the BSO, a man called Stanley Bradford, who was who'd been involved in various further and higher education enterprises. Stanley was quite entrepreneurial, and he persuaded the board, highly controversially, to sell the freehold of Buckingham Gate and to take on a much bigger building.
Yeah.
And so, and at the same time, they dramatically increased the size of intakes. So they went from taking 20 to 25 a year,
right,
to taking about 100 a year.
Wow. And was there the demand for that? Was that any sort of challenge getting that number of students in? Or?
No, there seemed to be no challenge getting the students in. But what happened was, and I'm pretty sure that 1979 was the first big intake, September 79. They had not at that stage identified a large building in which to relocate the BSO. So the first intake did all their theory classes at Central Methodist Hall, Westminster,
right,
just off Parliament Square.
Yeah.
And then they went to Buckingham Gate on a Monday or a Wednesday evening, I think it was, and were split into lots of small groups and did their practical osteopathic technique. And I was one of the people who helped teaching osteopathic technique.
Yeah.
And they would be in a big group in the largest classroom the BSO had, and Audrey Smith would teach a large group. Then they'd be split into small groups and spread around the building practicing. And it was a pretty high risk strategy by Stanley and the then board of directors. And to cut a really long well, to cut a long story short, they ended up moving to Suffolk Street, the building in Suffolk Street.
By Trafalgar Square.
On the corner of the Haymarket, and they started that. We moved in there in sort of the summer of 1980, and it was both a blessing and a curse, that building. And I don't know whether you ever visited it.
I've been there quite a number of times actually. Yeah.
Yeah, it was for people listening who didn't go. It was a former combined universities club, so it was very much York stone exterior, and the first two floors the ground and the first two floors were large rooms that had been club rooms for gentlemen. And then the top two floors was a warren of small rooms that had been accommodation for gentlemen wishing to stay over in London. And the BSO took this on a long lease from the Crown Estates, and it was a blessing in that it had a combination of large rooms that could be used for teaching, and it had small rooms that meant a very large clinic could be incorporated into the site. So the the clinic was spread over the second and third floors, or first, second, and third floors.
Right.
And it had a whole load of treatment rooms. And then right on the top floor, there were a few offices and a flat for the caretaker.
Right. Right.
And it kind of accommodated what the BSO was trying to do fairly well. And when people were asked, it provided instant status for an osteopathic institution. People would come to visit and would, walk around the corner or get out of a cab and go, gosh, these guys are serious. And so it conveyed this sense of permanence and establishment.
Yeah.
And Stanley set about getting a degree course approved. And I think he first went to the Polytechnic of Central London, or Westminster Poly. Martin Collins will know much more about this than I do.
Right.
And the first attempt to get the course accredited as a degree had taken place, I think, while they were still at Buckingham Gate, and it had received extremely short shrift. The conversation was over in minutes or hours.
Oh, really? Okay.
Then we got to Suffolk Street, and they tried again, and it lasted a bit longer. But the kind of, it's the only way I can put it, the lack of educational maturity kind of could not be compensated for, let's put it that way.
Yeah. Okay.
So we were a profession that were used to saying, this is what I do, you do it, yeah, that's fine. So it was very much an apprenticeship model.
Yes, yeah, I see, yeah.
And a teaching of what to do in situations. And so that took us through the 80s, or into the 80s. And let's see, we moved there in 1980. About 1983, I think Stan, and I have to choose my words, which people who know me will remember that I like to do. It became clear that Stanley's strategy had kind of been based on achieving degree recognition. And the financial and academic progress of the school was a bit precarious. So Stanley left.
Yeah.
And one of the directors was a guy called Stuart Humphrey, who worked up in Harpenden. Very old school osteopath, very nice man. Typical early osteopathic practice in a red brick house in a nice suburb of a nice town in southern England.
Yeah.
And one of his patients was Norman Lindop, who was then the director of Hatfield Polytechnic, and had chaired the data protection report committee, which produced the Lindop report, which was Britain's first attempt at data protection.
Right.
And he'd also chaired the committee that ran allied health, so the committee that looked after physiotherapy and other professions.
Right.
So Norman was a widely experienced person, and anyway, when he retired from Hatfield Poly, he came to run the BSO.
Okay.
And he introduced a lot more kind of more academic credibility, and in an unfortunate chain of events, the strategic decision was taken to approach the Council for National Academic Awards, the CNAA, to approve the BSO's degree program.
Right.
And by then I had been the head of the technique department. I took over, or I was appointed to do that when Laurie Hartman stepped down.
Yeah.
And then I'd run the clinic at the BSO. And we started to get involved in dealing with the CNAA. But about that time, the Minister for Education decided that he wanted a report on whether the CNAA had a long-term future.
Yeah.
So he appointed a high-powered committee, small but high-powered committee, to investigate the CNAA.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I was leading the team that was writing this degree program with Derek Edwards, who was, and we became the two vice principals. He was the academic and I was professional vice principal.
Yeah.
And about the time we got heavily engaged with the CNAA, this committee, which Norman Lindop had chaired, recommended that CNAA be abolished.
Oh, no.
So I found myself meeting delegations from the CNAA with Norman Lindop sitting next to me.
Yeah.
And all these guys from the CNAA glaring at Norman because he was instrumental in eventually putting them out of a job.
Right. Oh gosh. Yeah.
So we went through that, and we had our degree approved by the CNAA. In what I later learned was a typical institutional visit. You know, they sent a team of people.
Yeah.
And their team was led by Caroline Cox, Baroness Caroline Cox, who was one of Margaret Thatcher's darlings, who was this formidable, staunchly Christian peer who'd worked as a social work and sociology lecturer at the Polytechnic of North London and spoken out about what she saw as the communist and Trotskyist cabal that was kind of holding North London Poly to account.
Right.
And so she turned up with this team of people to put our degree program through the ringer, which they did over a day and a half, I think. And in the end, we got our degree approved. And that was it was an eye-opening experience for me. Norman Lindop was an extremely interesting guy to work for, and we dealt with some really interesting people at sort of different polytechnics and universities. And so over that period, from the kind of mid-70s to the early 90s, there were a lot of changes.
Yeah, right. A
lot of changes, and it was a huge. Bearing in mind one of the problems that we had to confront and address for the CNAA was that, as was traditional, the vast majority of faculty members taught for a day or maybe 2 days a week. And so they were very concerned about the collective nature of education and where institutional wisdom resided and how that worked, and could you really provide good academic and pastoral care for 100 students a year? If you were, if the key people in your team were only there for 12 hours a week or 18 hours a week or whatever.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I guess that's always been the challenge with osteopathy.
Very much so, because you want people who, and our defense was, but these people are out in the workplace doing this every week.
Exactly, yeah.
And therefore they're able to bring real world and real time experience to talk to students, rather than employing a team of people who did it in the past but don't do it now.
Yeah. So then what?
And that
go on.
Yeah, go on.
What I was going to say is, are we at the point now where you're about to sort of take over leadership of the BSO? You were principal as of 1990, weren't you?
Yeah, Norman stepped down, and the board advertised the position, and after a lot of discussion, I applied. And it was very interesting to be. There was some feeling amongst a significant number of people that they wanted an osteopath to run the BSO again, for it not to be someone who was an entrepreneur or a member of the establishment as an administrator.
And was the feeling sort of was that really because you'd seen issues and challenges with these people from the outside coming in, perhaps not understanding the profession as intimately as someone who is actually in the profession would do?
I think what subsequently became clear to me, and is still sometimes the case, is that in places like the BSO, as in hospitals and educational institutions, it's easy for a tension to develop between the professional people and the managerial people. So in terms of meeting objectives and delivering financial targets, there's quite a lot of literature about, who has the last say, and it's an ongoing thing, if you like, in public discourse today, that should a treatment be available, should the health professional have the last word on yes or no, or should the person who is the managerial person have the last word? And so whichever of those people it appears to have the last word, there will be connotations attached to it. And so it's not unusual in large hospitals or universities for the professional group to feel that somebody in a suit, quote unquote, has the last word, and they don't really understand the issues that the professionals have to cope with. Yes,
because you've had an involvement with the hospital, haven't you?
Yeah, later on, after I left the BSO, I was appointed as the non-executive director of the trust hospital in the town where I lived, and that was a really interesting experience. Sitting as a non-exec with doctors and managers, and being on committees. I was on the complaints committee and the capital expenditure committee, so looking at arguments and making final decisions. And so getting into those kind of situations, you understand that there's no perfect answer. If a health professional, for instance, becomes a senior manager, it's not unusual for the health professionals to feel that when they take a decision that the health professionals would not have taken, the person concerned has gone over to the other side, the dark side.
Right.
And vice versa. So
I remember having a conversation with Ian Drysdale actually at one point, because one of the things that I picked up even as a student was that when you're principal, it's almost like you're the referee of a football match or something, and you can't please all the people all the time. You're always going to be upsetting someone. It's like whatever decision you make, it's going to be annoying someone, right?
That's absolutely right. And Norman Lindop, Norman and I had some conversations about those sorts of things, and also once you're the principal, and I know Ian and I talked about this. You can be in the pub with 5 other people that you've known for a long time. And you may think you're just one of the people chatting and enjoying a beer, but they never forget that you're the principal.
Right,
and go on. You can walk into a room and people stop talking.
That's
which they wouldn't have done.
Isn't it?
I think it kind of goes with the sitting in the chair or whatever you want to say.
I remember listening to an audio. There's a guy called David White who I like to listen to. He's actually a corporate poet of all things, which is very unusual in this day and age. But he goes into big corporations and uses poetry to help them understand the underlying dynamics around what might be going on in the workplace. And so he uses his own poetry, but also Shakespeare and various other sort of classic poets. But he tells a story about how some young hotshot was being promoted to the board, and one of the wise old men on the board said to him, this is a great day, but it's also the last day that your colleagues will tell you the truth.
There's a lot in that, and we at the BSO we went through problems. One of the issues that I had to deal with was that when we had our degree approved, shortly after that, the undergraduate funding rules changed, and there was a lot of acrimony about the fact that people were suddenly finding themselves faced with very high costs to study, and recruiting people became difficult, and there was a number of I can recall having telephone conversations with a number of angry parents who somehow felt that it was the BSO's fault and therefore my fault that this was happening, and that there would be something that I could do.
Right. Yeah.
And I actually had. I remember being at a thing at the CNAA in Gray's Inn Road, which Kenneth Clark was the guest and the speaker, and he did his little chat, and he was Secretary of State for Education, and I managed to kind of work my way towards him while he was eating a sausage roll or a mini quiche or whatever it was. And we all had badges on, but everybody knew who he was. And as I moved towards him, he clocked my badge with my name and institution on it, and I could see this. Oh Christ!
Oh really?
Look pass across his face. And I said to him, funding, yada da da da, and he said, well, here's the thing, there are two lists. There's a list of institutions that are funded, and there's a list of institutions that are not. And this one is in this drawer of my desk, and this list is in this other drawer, and you're on this list over here. How do we get across to the other list? Well, you don't.
Right.
And he said, that's just how it is. It's just those are the two groups of institutions. And so it got, and we kind of worked our way round it and through it, but that was a problem. And then we had big cash flow issues, and we found that there were problems. There were problems with VAT. About should we be charging VAT to our patients at the clinic, and that, because the BSO clinic is large, that involved a lot of people and a lot of transactions, so it was a very large sum of money. There are other things, which your listeners probably won't be interested in, although some of them will have experienced this. Is when is someone who works in your business self-employed, and when are they employed?
Right, and all the
and the Inland Revenue saying, well, we have concluded that all those people who come and teach part-time are employees, and that you should have been deducting PAYE, and you owe us this much money. And the number in the letter is an eye-watering number.
That's not a nice letter to receive.
Then it shows on your accounts as a liability, and it makes life even more difficult. And again, as we're speaking, interest rates from banks are in low single digits or even below zero. But back in 1990, that was not the case. And because the BSO was running an overdraft for a significant amount of the time, we were paying as much to the bank in interest as I was paying to people to teach.
I can believe it.
So it was quite hard, and I'd have meetings with staff and students over the years, and my preference has always been in those situations to either tell the truth or to say I that's something I can't tell you at this time. And I remember saying to students once, look, you have to understand that the situation as it is may not represent the way I would like it to be. This is just the best we can do at the moment. And Ian and I had that conversation. This is what we do. This is the curriculum, and you may assume that I think it's perfect.
Yeah.
When in fact I would really like to change it, but we're doing the best that we can under the circumstances. And so those kind of things, I don't think until you find yourself pinned to the wall by a pitchfork with a lot of angry people carrying torches trying to burn your castle down, you don't appreciate that some of the job is defending a situation that you would really rather not obtained, but that you at the moment you can't change.
That's pretty tough. And you're quite young as well, so you were in your late 30s when you took over.
I was in my late 30s at that point.
That's amazing. Had you had any ambition to be involved at that level, or did it just kind of evolved?
No, it just kind of turned out that way. One of the things that I don't know whether it's widely known, when the BSO, now UCO, obviously was, and I think remains, a strange hybrid organisation. It's a registered charity, and therefore bound by all the contents of the Charities Act and so on and so on. But it's also a limited company, and when they set up the limited company, I think in the late 40s, when Little John died, they created 500 shares, A shares, and they created some B shares. And the B shares were held by somebody who was considered to be absolutely rock solid, trustworthy, and they would always be able to outvote any kind of move by other shareholders to sell up the institution or incorporate something in the curriculum that really was not osteopathic. And what we worked out soon after I became principal, the first thing was that up to and including Norman Lindop's time, the principal was the secretary to the board. The principal did not vote at board meetings, and the principal was not really accountable in terms of being a director of the company. And we had a couple of external directors who said, well, that's going to change. And promptly got the Charities Commission to approve the fact that one member of the board could be paid. And so I became effectively a managing director and chief executive, and a member of the board. So that changed, and then we went from having an osteopath as chair of the board to having an external chair. And so we made that change, which was a good thing, because I then had chairs of the board who had massive experience of the world beyond osteopathy. And the people who were on the BSO board were tremendous people. They gave their time and they were totally dedicated, but many of them didn't have the experience or the skills to run or to be accountable for running and the governance of an organisation with £1 million turnovers and big issues to deal with. And so I then had a chair of the board who was Sir William Staveley, who'd been first Sea Lord, and his CV was that he'd entered the Navy as a midshipman and he finished as Admiral of the Fleet. And he, by definition, was a big picture person, and was a fantastic chair to have. But we worked out that the BSO shares were no longer being sold to graduates, and the rule was that only graduates could buy a share, and they could only buy one share. And when we looked, we found that we were up into the high 400s, so there were no shares left to sell. And so the involvement of graduates in the strategy and the direction of the BSO, of turning up to annual general meetings and being able to ask questions, was severely compromised. So we went through the process and issued another 5,000
Right.
shares. I think it may have been 1,000, I don't know, but it was a lot.
Yeah.
And we put the price up from £1 to £10. But it meant that we got a lot of buy-in. Suddenly graduates started buying a share and turning up to annual general meetings and saying, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Which I think is essential, or is...
I was going to say, so was that an effective strategy? Because I can imagine it could be very effective, but also it could be disastrous in terms of making it so complex, so many different opinions and ideas.
I think it worked well because we had Sir William was the chair, then we had another chair who'd been the chief executive of Building Society and responsible for multi-million pound organisations, and they were very good at guiding the fact that shareholders are entitled to turn up and say, we think the direction of the school needs to be this, or we think that your strategy to try to resolve fees issues or whatever, or the what are we going to do now that we have an act, what are the implications for the school, how should we move forward, bearing in mind that we are one day going to have statutory regulation. But they were very good at saying, yes, that's fine, and the management team will take that away and look at it. But, the AGM is not a management group. It does not make management day-to-day operational decisions. That's the job of the chief executive and the team who run the place on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
But I do think it's a useful thing to have to show up and explain, have you met your financial targets? Have you done this? And I was really fortunate. I had a really good team of people. And we did meet our financial targets. We had a lovely meeting with the Inland Revenue at which they explained their situation about self-employed status, and we explained what we did, and we kind of haggled with them a bit, or I haggled with them a bit, and they said, well, look, how about this? And we, and we shook hands and we said, yep, so people this side of this criterion, they're self-employed. Anybody over this side will be employed. And suddenly that meant that the big liability of you owe us this much going back 10 years was lifted.
Right. Yeah.
And then we got a legal opinion and went to court and dealt with Her Majesty's Customs and Excise.
Right.
And we won that, and we got a huge repayment of VAT that we'd been forced to charge to patients.
Okay.
So we got that money back.
Oh, good.
And that made a big difference.
Okay.
So on that basis, that was good. And then in 1992, we had the first class graduate with a degree, rather than a diploma.
Yeah. So that was a BSc.
Yeah, that's right.
Excellent. And so while that was all going on, you were doing your own degree. You're doing a master's degree in philosophy and healthcare, right?
Yeah, I did that at University of Wales, University College Swansea, with Stephen Timon and Bevis Nathan, and I all did that. And I started doing that before I was appointed as the principal, and there was a while there, kind of around 1991, where I found myself grappling with, I was doing clinical work 1 day a week and running the BSO 4 days a week, and then I would sit trying to write a master's thesis.
In your spare time?
And in my spare time with 3 small children, and without word processors, it was pretty it was pretty basic in those days.
Lots of trips to the British Library,
and it was and so I and then we had the Osteopaths Act, and because because we were at the other end of Whitehall from the Palace of Westminster, I had a lot to do with Simon Fielding, who was the kind of principal architect, and it was easy for him to bring people along to the BSO to have a look around and say, well, you know, this is what osteopathy is about, this is what we do, and they'd come in and we'd have a chat and a cup of coffee, or occasionally go for a glass of wine.
Yes.
So I got to know Simon quite well, and Malcolm Moss was the MP who chose the Osteopaths Act, or the bill, as a private members bill when he won the private members lottery.
Oh, okay.
And Simon took him out for lunch with the two civil servants who were responsible for dealing with osteopaths. And I went with them, and we went out for lunch.
Yes.
I just remember we were in a restaurant in St Martin's Lane.
Right, yes.
When a bomb went off in a pub about 100 yards up the road, and we had to evacuate the restaurant, and I have this image of standing in St Martin's Lane with Malcolm Moss and these two civil servants and Simon Fielding.
Yeah.
And Malcolm Moss very sensibly insisted that he take the bottle of wine with him, and we all stood there with our glasses chatting away about what was going to happen with the Osteopaths Act.
Yeah, very surreal.
It was, and it was interesting. It was another facet of running a building in that part of London at that time that, you know, my services manager would put his head into my office and say, the police have been on the phone, there's a bomb threat.
Right.
You know, there's a bomb somewhere in SW1. So when are they coming to search the building? They're not. We have to search our own building.
Oh, God, yeah.
And so we had to develop ways of things to do in the event of, you know. And it's interesting. You can't really. It's difficult to ask people to go and look, particularly when you've got a library that is open to the public.
Yes. Was that always a thing,
you know,
for the BSO, that the library was a public library?
In the sense that it was open access, not for borrowing rights, but people could go in there and, So that was a decision that I think Stanley Bradford began that. Certainly Norman Lindop was very, very strongly of the opinion that, you know, knowledge was something that was important and that people should have open access to it. So that it was driven that way.
Yeah, right.
Which was good. And librarians, of course, have this strange kind of cosmic frequency that they operate on. So they all talk to each other. And the librarian at the BSO would obviously talk to the librarians at the BCNO and ESO and other people, and they all collaborate and get on, which I think is tremendous. You know, we had some good librarians, great librarians, still do.
Excellent. And so what was the connection with Princess Anne? When did that connection with the BSO start?
I have that started when Norman Lindop was the principal, if I remember rightly. I'm not sure now how it came about. Right. It would have been that someone connected with the board knew someone. The BSO had some really interesting people on its board. I should mention Margot Gore, who was chair of the board for a while, who used to practice in Buckinghamshire, who was a charming woman, and who it was quite widely known to her contemporaries, but later came out that she spent the war ferrying planes around. She was one of a group of female pilots who used to deliver war aircraft for the RAF.
Wow.
And so she had this background before she did osteopathy and went to the BSO of being a pilot who'd, you know, fly bombers and fighters around, deliver them to the RAF.
Wow.
And so, that group of people who were the kind of career change people that went into osteopathy in the 40s and 50s had some really interesting connections, and one of them, I think, had some connection with the Princess Royal.
Okay, yes.
And so she was invited to be the patron, and she very happily, I think, agreed. And she's always been a fantastic ambassador for the institution.
Yeah, excellent. So how long did you stay as principal at the BSO?
It was about 7.5, nearly 8 years.
Yeah. So,
and the thing, I suppose the three things that I was heavily involved in. One was getting the degree program. The second was getting the finances healthy again, and the third was relocating from Suffolk Street to Borough High Street.
yes.
What we found out was that the Suffolk Street building was was owned by the Crown Estate, and a lease had been signed by the BSO when they took on the building, which committed them to I think it was 5 yearly rent reviews.
Right.
But there was in the contract, it said, and these are upward only.
Okay.
They can own, the rent can only ever go up.
Yes.
Or stay the same, I guess.
Yeah.
But in the event of a property crash and rents all over London going down, the Crown was under no obligation ever to put the rent down.
Right.
And it became clear that the rent was ever only going to go up and would become a bigger and bigger proportion of operating costs. And by the mid-90s, London was getting busier. There was a bus stop in on the corner of Trafalgar Square there, just at the end of Pall Mall.
Yes.
So people using the lecture room on the ground floor would regularly have to put up with route buses stopping and pulling away.
Yeah.
And up in the upper floors, it was a bit of a labyrinth. The heating system was ancient.
Yeah.
It needed several £1 million spending on it to bring it up to standard, to make it a good place in which to run a degree program. And people gave us advice. We sought professional advice. We looked at what it would cost. And then out of the blue, we were approached by the University of Notre Dame, if you're English, or Notre Dame, if you're American.
Yes.
In Indiana, and they were looking for a European headquarters building.
Right.
And to cut a long story short, we went through various machinations of them approaching us to take on the building. And one of the exciting elements of that was that we got some surveyors in to give us advice, and they said, the lease requires you to hand the building over in good condition. And what you do is you have a schedule of condition of what it was like when you moved in.
Right.
And you were required to hand it back to the landlord in that condition. But no schedule of condition was ever undertaken.
Oh, right. Okay.
And so the liability to the BSO was enormous.
Right.
We would have had to have spent a considerable amount of money just to get out of the building.
Right. So it's a stroke of luck.
Well, the university said, well, we'll waive that.
Okay.
I spent quite a bit of time dealing with the guy who was heading the project, who was a lovely Catholic priest named Timothy Scully.
Right.
And he was a kind of academic priest, broad Irish American guy, lovely man. And he said, look, we're not bothered about that. We really like the building. We've researched the origins of the building. And the whole process became tortuous. We thought we had a building, and we got it all ready. We got the agreement ready to go, and then the people selling the building changed their minds and sold it to somebody else, the one that the BSO was going to take on. And
Oh gosh.
we were working to deadlines, and I
Yeah.
phoned Timothy Scully in the States and said, I've got bad news. This has happened, so we can no longer go ahead. And he said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, we'll start looking again for a new location. And he said, well, we'll give you time to do that.
Okay.
Which was extremely kind of him to do that.
Yeah. Excellent.
And a lot of people who were associated with the BSO were not happy at the idea of moving from the location.
Yes.
Because it was a lovely address, and
Yeah, of course.
it's the corner of Trafalgar Square. You could go to galleries, and you could go to all kinds of lovely places.
Yeah,
but a number of times I said to my colleagues, look, to really upgrade the building would cost £5 million. And if we had £5 million, we would be mad to spend it on a building that will never belong to us.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
If we had 5 million, we wouldn't stay.
Yes.
And because we haven't got 5 million, we shouldn't stay.
That's right. Yeah.
And so we found, I spent ages looking at buildings, and we found that building in Borough High Street. And we put together a finance deal, and our bankers were Barclays Bank, who were across the road from us at the time.
Yes.
At the bottom of the Haymarket. And we put this complex package together, and our bank manager set off into the hierarchy of Barclays Bank, and he got back to me and said it's been approved, and it's gone all the way to a Barclay, and they've looked at what you're proposing to do, and they've approved it.
Oh wow.
And which was a kind of way of saying this is a really close decision. Nobody felt able to make it. They kept passing it up and up and up.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Interesting.
And we were fortunate to be able to find a building with an equity lease. So the BSO bought the remaining lease, I think, of 60-something years on the building in Borough. And so the lease became an asset rather than a liability.
Yes. Yeah. Right.
And that made life much easier. And also by then, the Act was 93, and as I was leaving the BSO, the GOSC had been formed and was beginning to look at how it was going to put its policies together. So I had a few meetings, and we formed the I felt it was really important that the institutions providing educational programs get together. So Derek Edwards, I think, was still at the BSO then, but we tried to get the other institutions together, and we formed COE, the Council of Osteopathic Education.
Yes. Okay.
Institution.
Okay. Yeah.
It would have been good to call it the Council of Osteopathic Colleges, but COC would not be a good.
Good foresight there. Good foresight.
Would not have been a good acronym.
It wouldn't.
No.
Excellent.
So we went with COE, and that, I think it was important that the colleges had a forum in which they could discuss things and provide an opportunity to exchange ideas, and then go to the GOSC as a group.
Yes. Yeah.
Instead of being dealt with purely on an individual basis, which of course continued to happen.
Yeah. Sure. Okay, so what was it that sort of led to you deciding it was time to wrap up at the BSO? Was the opportunity in New Zealand on the horizon at that point, or was that still not featuring?
No, I'd been running the BSO for 7 years, and we'd gone through a huge financial amount of turmoil. And the day after I remember it really well, the day after the 1992 election, when John Major got back into power, that Friday I was in London, and our bank manager took my finance director and I out to lunch, and it was a turning point. I think it was the first time in my life I'd had a bank manager who was younger than me.
That's concerning.
Which is it is concerning. It's the start of a steady glide path down from that point.
Yeah.
And he took my finance director was a lovely woman called Kate Stewart Smith.
Yeah.
He took the two of us out to lunch, and there was a very strange atmosphere in London that day. It was like everybody had woken up to a situation they didn't expect.
Yes. Yeah.
It was kind of spooky, and he sat down and we had lunch, and he said, well done, I didn't think you were going to do it. And we said, what? And he said, we would have closed you down. We would have shut the BSO down if you didn't solve the finance problems. We were ready to call in the liquidators, and you'd have come in and found the doors chained.
Yeah.
So it was that was like a glass of water down the back of your neck.
Yeah, right.
I think we knew it was real, but nobody had ever actually said. Nobody had ever uttered the words.
This is how close.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So we'd done that, and we'd moved to school, and getting through that and dealing with putting together this deal in which the people we bought the lease from agreed to take staged payments, and we had to pay compensation to the University of Notre Dame to allow them to make good the problems with the Suffolk Street building.
Okay.
But everybody agreed to take staged payments rather than us having to come up with this big check on day one.
Yeah.
And that was very, very complex to do. And by that stage, I'd been the principal for 7+ years. And I said to people, look, I've been at the BSO for half my life as a student, and then teaching, and then as principal, and I'd been involved pretty much non-stop for nearly 24 years.
Yeah.
Which was a long time. And I just felt that in order to get the BSO through the next phase of its evolution, which was to carry out the financial plan, make good all of the commitments, get used to working in a new location, you really had to sign on for 4 or 5 years to do that.
Yeah.
And I thought, I just didn't think I had the energy or the stamina to do another 5 years. And I thought it would be better to step aside and let them identify somebody else to do that, rather than to get a year or two into the process and throw in the towel.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So I did that, and it was soon after that I got the hospital appointment, and I was just enjoying doing.
So where was that again?
That was in Kettering in Northamptonshire, where I used to live.
Okay. Yeah.
So I was working. I was working in the clinic that I was running there, and that was going well. And I was doing some overseas teaching and other stuff. And then this opportunity came up in New Zealand, where there had been a small part-time school for some years, but the majority of osteopaths here were overseas trained. Some had been in Australia, some had been trained in the UK. They found an institution to take on providing a program in osteopathy, and they recruited an American guy who was a sort of retired DO educator, a guy called David Patriquin, who'd actually been a military osteopath. And some of your listeners will be aware that the American profession has a very strong and rightly proud tradition of DOs serving in the military.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah. So there's a whole sub-branch of American DOs who've served in lots of theatres of war.
Right.
And some of the US Armed Forces most senior medical people have been DOs. But as
Actually, funny.
as is often the case, it's often not mentioned that they're a DO rather than MD.
Yeah. Well, one of the stories I was about to mention is the guy who I've done a lot of training with at a postgraduate level is a chap called Paul Check, and he was in the 82nd Airborne Division.
Oh yeah.
And his kind of background was he got involved with the Army boxing team. He was a boxer himself. He became the trainer to the boxing team. But the head of the medical team was a doctor. It was an osteopathic doctor, and so I think right early in his career he had quite a strong osteopathic influence.
Yep.
And that's very much reflected in his teachings now. So you mentioning that sort of all adds up.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
so some senior figures in the osteopathic profession were DOs, and David Patriquin was recruited by Unitec to come here and set up the program, and they decided they would go with the model that was in place over the Tasman in Australia, and they went for a 3-year bachelor's with a 2-year master's degree. And David was here for a year designing the bachelor's degree before there were any students, which anyone who's done a lot of teaching will think that would just be a blissful existence. And then he took on the first cohort and taught them the first year of that program. And then he came to the end of his 2-year contract and went back to the States. I think he was from Vermont.
Right.
He went back there, and Unitec had a little go at recruiting somebody to work there, but decided they would carry on with local osteopaths. David had recruited a whole load of local people who came in, and mostly on a volunteer basis. They had a couple of people they were employing to do some teaching, but so they taught the second year of the program for the first time, and they repeated the first year. And as they got through the end of the first semester, they realized that they did not have the resources, human resources needed to go through the third year of the cycle, which would involve teaching the third year of the bachelor's degree, writing and getting approval for a master's degree. And so anybody who's been involved knows that, the first time that you go through the delivery of what looked good on paper is quite a challenge, because you've got to write the stuff and deliver it. And you should also be polishing the previous years. And so for an institution that hadn't delivered an osteopathic program before, they leant very heavily on the people on the other floors of the building who were doing medical imaging degrees and nursing degrees. And sports medicine, sports science, and there was also some veterinary medicine, veterinary nursing degrees. So there was a bit of crossover with them as well. But they decided they needed somebody with the experience of writing degree programs and running teaching clinics and teaching and clinical practice. So they asked me to come, and originally I was going to come for 3 years.
Right.
And so my wife and I, and our youngest of our 3 children came. He was 14 at the time. And we came, so the first year, 2001, we arrived in January, which, as we're speaking, was a week ago today.
Right.
And the first year was breathless. You arrive in a new country. There's a container full of furniture somewhere between Harwich and Auckland. You've got to get ready to deal with a group of students who had not been very happy the year before, which is an understatement. You've got to recruit, and you've got to decide how the third year of a program is going to be delivered for the first time, and set up the team to teach that. At the same time, I said, so this master's degree, yes, when does it need to be ready? Oh, by September. And then what? Oh, then we have to go through a formal approval process. Ah, good. So the first year was really full on, and we got the master's program written and the formal approval process by the New Zealand Qualifications Authority. They sent a team of people to go through one of those accreditation processes, which are always such fun. And
yes, yeah.
And I remember saying to the institution that the chief executive of the institution at that time was a guy called John Webster, who was from the west of Scotland, and he had one of those lovely west of Scotland accents and spoke very quietly and in a sing-song voice. And if I had any issues, I could go straight down the corridor and find his office and talk to him. Although I talked to my own head of department and dean, but I had got quite used to talking to him. And then I said to somebody, so this clinic we need for next year, yes. Where is it going to be? Well, we thought about this building here, and well, that's not going to be big enough. Right. And so all those kind of things, they were enjoyable and soluble. But then for the next 2 years, we were teaching a master's degree. And the weakness of, I've said this many times in many places, so I'm quite happy to say it again. It's very difficult asking students to complete a master's level thesis when they've had no experience of the workplace.
Yes.
And so people would make the leap across from a bachelor's degree to a master's degree, and they had in this country they would be starting the master's degree in February, and they would need to, in order to graduate at the end of the following year, so let's say November, so you're looking at 21 months. So you're giving people 21 months to touch a real patient for the first time, because there was no Act here at the time, so anybody could practice. And so the profession, when they designed the bachelor's degree, had not wanted any clinical work in the bachelor's degree, because there's a concern that people would then go off and do osteopathy without a proper qualification. So you go from no clinical experience to clinical competence in 21 months. At the same time as acquiring all these skills and writing a dissertation, which has to be externally marked and meet international master's standards. And that is, and to say to somebody, we want you to be a competent clinician and to do all this other stuff, and you've got less than 2 years to do it. And your research has to be comparable to any other master's level research. So, a physiotherapist or a radiographer, medical imaging technician doing a master's level degree would probably go back into master's level study after 2 or 3 years of workplace experience, and they would have formulated questions or areas of interest in that time and have had a chance to say, that's something I'm interested in. And if you're not interested in your research, actually buckling down and doing it is it's really, really hard,
Yeah, of course. So I'm trying to understand the structure. So basically the structure was that they start out with a bachelor's degree. Yeah. For across how many years? 3 years?
3 years full time, yeah.
3 years full time, and then they do another 21 months to get the master's.
Well, it's another four semesters, but one of the problems. So in the UK, you and I did a 4-year diploma. Did you do a diploma or bachelor's?
I did the bachelor's.
Right, yeah. But so between the second and third year, you do a summer clinic session.
That's right, yeah.
And so you spend a number of weeks doing full-time clinical practice. So you arrive in your third year, you've already done some clinical work, and you do some full-time clinical experience as a junior student. Then you do your third year, then you do another clinical placement in the summer of your third year. And so you arrive in your final year with well over a year of clinical experience and 2 summers worth of doing nothing but treating people, doing a 9 to 5 clinical shift.
Yeah.
Down here, people complete their bachelor's degree, let's say in the summer of 2001, and they graduate from the bachelor's degree. They don't enroll in the master's degree until the beginning of 2002, so they're no longer students. They can't do clinical work because they're not registered as students. Furthermore, in the Southern Hemisphere, there is a big shutdown from just before Christmas until around the 5th or 6th of January. Nobody, institutions are closed. So the summer workload is very different here to a summer in London. In London at the BSO, UCO, BCom, it's open every week during the summer. There'll be different people there. They come and go. But in the universities down here, the place shuts down for 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And so doing that summer placement thing is a completely different challenge, different prospect.
Right, yeah. Because we don't have Christmas in the middle of summer here.
No, you don't. And people can do clinical placements during the Easter vacation and the Christmas vacation.
Yeah.
So getting students up to speed with clinical experience and competence is a really tough call in these configurations. And the first university or the first state-funded program here was at the Philip Institute in Melbourne. And somebody who taught me, Peter Hawkins, was recruited by the Philip Institute to help them get that up and running. And they did a 4-year program for a while, and then they worked out that they could not get everything into the curriculum that they wanted to in the 4 years.
Yeah.
And so they upped it to 5 years, and so early graduates from the Philip Institute, which was then absorbed into Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, RMIT, they did a 4-year program, then they did a 5-year program, but the university solved the problem of what qualification to award by awarding them 2 degrees. They got 2 bachelor's degrees at the end of 5 years. The first time I went to RMIT, I said, so which degree do they do first? And they said, well, they don't. What do you mean? Well, they just study for 5 years and they get 2 bachelor's degrees at the end.
Wow. So it's kind of an academic points type system.
It was a strange solution. The problem with the solution became clear that they could never. They were confined to undergraduate funding models, and the osteopathy program was in the same building as the chiropractic program at RMIT.
Okay.
And for many years, the whole department was run by a chiropractor, a guy called Andre Kleinehans. And I'm not clear why, but the proportion of chiropractic students to osteopathic students was always something like 80-20.
Okay. Yeah.
And the funding was not great, and so it was a pretty tricky time for them. And as a result, a breakaway group went to Victoria University in Melbourne, and they came up with the 3+2 model, and students did the 3 years of the bachelor's and automatically transitioned into the master's degree, which was funded on a very different model. So the university found that they could generate the funds they needed to do a lot of research and a lot of clinical
Okay. Yeah,
content,
yeah.
and so the 3+2 model became the standard model. But the problems that I outlined before were always there. You know, you're asking neophyte people to come up with master's level research, and if you're in a big research driven university, you may well have the research program going on that students can buy into.
Yeah.
The problem at Unitec was that it was an institute of technology, a polytechnic, with no great research momentum in that area. And so it was really difficult for students to identify a topic.
Right, yeah.
And over the years, over the last 15 years, there's been a substantial move away from the 5-year 3+2 model.
Okay.
And I've also been quite clear in public that around the world, it's been the case that the profession has said we need research in order to validate osteopathy. We need research, and so we'll do that by making students do good research. And I think it is, I think it's a profoundly flawed strategy to say that the profession needs saving by underpinning with research outcomes, and we're going to get undergraduates to do that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
It's simply not going to work. So one of the things we did when I was at the BSO, we tried to invest long term in research. We had a good relationship with Brian Kleger at the AECC, Anglo-European College of Chiropractic, in Bournemouth. We funded people like Isle Lederman to do a PhD, and we put money into other research people. People like Steve Vogel. And what I think we saw was that it takes a really long time to grow that research culture. It does happen, but it's a tremendously long-term process, and you take on those things and you think, yeah, we'll do this, and it does bear fruit.
Yes.
And there is a genuine, and I think highly worthy community of osteopathic researchers now.
Yes, for sure.
But it's 30 years since I took on the BSO position, and we started putting money into that kind of activity, and it's arguably it took 15 to 20 years for it to really start gathering momentum, and it's going well now.
Yeah, interesting. I guess looking back, it because you saw the whole process unfold, it must have seemed quite slow at the time, but looking back now, it probably is quite exciting to see where you've got to and where the profession's got to.
I think it's great, and I think osteopathy, the nature of clinical osteopathy, has changed. Everything's changed, hasn't it? The world.
It has. Yeah, for sure.
The world we look at.
Well, I was interested in the way that your practice has changed as well, because obviously you've been, right at that kind of cutting edge of seeing the trends come and go, and the knowledge obviously increase and become more amalgamated with other disciplines. The whole debate around the philosophies being important, that kind of thing. And so I was quite intrigued as to where you're at in your own, practice and philosophy of osteopathy.
That's something I think about a lot. It's a couple of years since I got involved with the Osteopathic International Alliance in its early days, and through working on the board of the OIA, I met Johannes Meyer, who is a German doctor osteopath. And after we'd worked together on the OIA board for a while, he said that he and a colleague were planning to produce a textbook. And they would really like an English language editor to work with them.
Right, yeah.
And so we agreed we would do this. And then after a while, the other guy, Matthias, worked out he didn't have the time to do it. And so Johannes and I spent several years producing this textbook of osteopathic medicine.
Yes.
German edition, now English edition.
Do you know what? I contributed a chapter, as you probably recall.
Correct.
I have to say I wasn't quite as heavily involved as my co-writer, but it's the first textbook that I've been involved with where I don't understand what I actually wrote because I don't have an English copy yet.
Do you not? Leave that with me, and I'll see if I can get them to send you one. But it was really interesting reading several times.
Yes.
All of the contributions to that. And I a phrase I've been playing with for the last few days is that it's a combination of belief and disbelief, really,
right,
that we, and maybe when I started, it was heavily weighted towards the belief end.
Mm-hmm.
That's not to say that people like Colin Dove and Audrey Smith were not assiduous in being rational and looking at science. And
sure.
Colin was instrumental in bringing Kim Kaur to the BSO several times.
Which is also known as Irving Kaur for those people that aren't aware of that.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And he was a lovely guy.
Yeah.
And I remember talking to him, and he said to me, one of my students said to me, if you could get everybody you've ever taught in a room together and do one last presentation, what would you do? And Kim said, he said, I'd apologize for all the crap I told them when I didn't know any better.
Yeah.
Which was a remarkably humble thing from somebody like him.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I was interested to read Shilton Webster Jones's speech to the dinner the BSO held to celebrate its Diamond Jubilee in 1977.
Yeah.
And he talked about the fact that when he took over from Little John and a new group of people became teachers, they had to confront the fact that some of the stuff they had been taught and were teaching didn't actually work.
Right. Yeah.
And it wasn't actually like that. And I think when we went through the degree thing, we as a profession, we had to teach critical thinking, and you have to say to students, well, you've got to find a way of questioning everything, but at the same time you've got to hold on to something.
Yes. Yeah.
In order to actually take any kind of move forward.
Yeah.
And I think that balancing act is quite hard.
Yeah.
And I've seen students and practitioners not be able to keep that balancing act going and to give up and go and do other things because the ability to maintain a number of models of reality in your head while you deal with somebody.
Yes.
And base your actions on initial outcomes can be quite challenging for people who are convinced there is a right and a wrong answer to the question, because that's not always the case when you deal with complex clinical realities.
Yes.
I think the two biggest things I see. The first thing is the world we live in. The stuff that we sat and listened to people telling us and wrote down, you can now stand at the bus stop and get any kind of document from anywhere on your smartphone. And so the exclusivity of knowledge and quote unquote experience is people can sit on a bus and look at a YouTube video of me or you.
Yeah.
They don't have to sign up for 4 years of their lives to do all that stuff.
Yeah.
And so what it is we're trying to do when we put an educational program together has had to be completely rethought. But I think the value of being in a room with an experienced person who can watch what you do and observe your interaction with a patient and provide meaningful feedback is still essential.
Yes.
And I've said to a few patients lately, when I think I put my first put my hands on a patient in 1975, at the end of my second year at the BSO.
Yeah.
And I would have dealt with people who were born in the 19th century.
Right. Yeah.
So the 75, 80-year-olds I dealt with then, they were really 80. They'd lived through 2 world wars.
Yeah.
They'd seen the motor car arrive, the radio, the television. Domestic life had changed. People went shopping every day. They walked to work, they biked to work, or they took the bus. And so for the first half of my clinical career, I was dealing with people who'd led physically very demanding lives. And so well over half of the people we dealt with when I was a student and a new practitioner, there was a lot of mechanical low back problem from people who'd abused and overused their backs.
Yes.
Now, the number of people who are involved in really physically demanding work is very small. All of the builders I see use battery pack, power tools. Hardly anybody uses a handsaw. All of the gear is delivered on pallets by people with high abs. About the only guys who are doing it the old way are the scaffolding people.
Yes. Yeah.
And the vast majority of patients, or a significant majority, maybe not a vast majority, but so many stress-induced problems. People, with mismatches between their physical workload and their adrenal, neuroendocrinological arousal levels. People spending immense amounts of time sitting, staring at screens, smartphones, driving, and the mismatch between physical and mental, emotional workloads is astonishing.
And is that because I've noticed when I looked you up that one of the things that you've got on a bio somewhere is that since 2013 you've successfully applied your experience in the areas of Chinese medicine and naturopathy. So is that something that's a kind of a latter development?
I worked after I left Unitec. I went to work in a college of Chinese medicine for a while.
Right.
That was a really interesting experience. It's a small college of Chinese medicine here in Auckland, and they were having difficulties with the qualifications authority, and they needed somebody to help them reframe the way they were running their teaching clinic and their degree. So I helped them iron out some problems they were having with compliance issues in the way they were running their teaching clinic and the way they were running their course. I helped them redesign their course. So there was that. And then I went to work in a college of naturopathy and did some institutional research and development for them and helped them do similar kinds of stuff.
Right.
So it's interesting looking at the commonalities between osteopathic practice and other non-orthodox medical practices. My experience was that we as a profession spent a long time putting things in our curriculum to act as a defense against the charge that we were unsafe and that we didn't we shouldn't be treating people because we would miss pathology. And so I've likened the osteopathic curriculum to the turkey that Baldrick works on in that famous episode of Blackadder when he just keeps shoving more and more stuff in the turkey. And osteopathic curricula around the world, to me, have looked like that poor bird. And I've said to students, everybody wants to put stuff in a curriculum. Very few people are happy to see their stuff taken out. and so that was one of the issues, when I was starting out. We put this in here not because we're going to diagnose this, but because we have to reassure whoever it is that we're not going to miss it.
Yeah, of course.
And that preoccupation remains. We design, things are still being designed to reassure onlookers that we are not dangerous, rather than to ensure that we're really, really competent.
Yes, for sure. Do you see?
And
Go on.
Go on.
I was going to say, do you see? Obviously, you were just alluding to the idea that the sort of psychoneuroimmunology side of things has become an increasing part of what we need an awareness of in the 21st century. And I mean, do you feel that the naturopathy and the Chinese medicine have additional tools that can be helpful in that? Is that part of the way your thinking has gone, or not necessarily?
I suppose so. I mean, those were kind of institutional jobs, really. But you kind of learn by hanging around with Chinese medical practitioners, traditional Chinese medicine, not Western medical acupuncture.
Yeah.
You begin to see a little bit how their paradigm works.
Yes. Yeah.
I think the other thing that increasingly strikes me is that, particularly the last 3.5 years, we live in a very fear-driven society. A lot of people make a lot of money out of generating anxiety in the general population. And I see part of my role as a clinician is to reassure people that actually they do have a lot of control over their lives, that there are things you can do. The osteopathy that I picked up at the BSO was very much about remaining active. There's a cartoon somewhere in one of the old BSO documents about somebody asking Little John, is rest a good treatment for this? And Little John saying rest is for the dead. And the BSO people that I was taught by, it was very, very much no, don't rest. Doing nothing is not a good therapeutic option. Stay even a little bit active, and that sense of control, that sense of purpose, of achievement, is fundamental to people regaining ownership of their lives. And touch is a really important part, and I think I've worked or dealt with people who are clear that and there's the wonderful, greatly missed Stephen Timon, and I would talk about the fact that touch somehow for a while became demeaned. A lot of medical technology, it's often said that the stethoscope was the beginning of the slippery slope away from medical practitioners touching their patients. And somehow osteopaths, I think there's a temptation for some osteopaths to still apologize for touching people. And one of the people I greatly enjoyed working with over the years was Phil Latey, who I don't think gets enough credit for the perspective he brought to bear on osteopathy. And Phil would say, and he and I remember not arguing with him, but teasing out the notion that touching people is a part of it, talking to people is part of it. Talking to people while they're being touched is hugely symbolic and very powerful. And so the conversations we have with our patients while we're working on them are really important, and the things they the insights they gain are often quite profound.
Yes.
And it's not because we're the source of profound insights. It's somehow, while their brain is working in a particular way and they're being worked on in a touch-based mode, that has a quite different effect.
Yes, definitely. Well, one of the guys that I quite like to listen to is a guy called Daniel Siegel, who's a psychiatrist, but also heavily into neurobiology, and he defines the mind as an embodied process which regulates the flow of energy and information. And the interesting thing about that definition is that it's not just his definition, but it's a think tank of psychiatrists and sociologists and anthropologists and people from all kinds of different disciplines who have looked at one definition of mind and said, well, that doesn't work for my discipline, and together across a period of years they honed and refined this definition of mind to be this embodied process which regulates the flow of energy and information. And if you think of what that means as an osteopath, well, we are engaging directly with that embodiment, and we're talking to them at the same time. So there's a kind of energy and information exchange. I don't know Phil Leahy personally, but I saw a number of his papers in the early Journal of Bodywork and Movement Therapies issues, and so I'm aware of his approach. But I imagine that that definition would sit quite neatly with the way he thinks about things.
Yeah, through Phil, we had a guy at the BSO called Peter Randall.
Yes, I know Peter. Yeah.
Who was a psychiatrist and left psychiatry, and I had the pleasure of teaching Peter when he was doing the BSO course. He was one of the students, and that was a memorable experience. And so, to get my own back, I then employed him as a tutor, and he once said something which struck me as very profound, which is probably why I remember it. And he said loads of stuff that I've forgotten, but he said, and he would always say you osteopaths. So he never, I think he struggled to include himself, but he said you touch people in a way that nobody has touched them since their mother touched them. He said it's not sexual, it's not possessive, it's not aggressive. It's a caring, nurturing touch. And he said you do not realize how profound that is. And people, certainly people have told me things that I know they've never disclosed to anyone else, and that experience is not exclusive to me.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And Peter's absolutely right. And so I'm sure he would probably want to challenge the definition. He'd want to change it because he's that kind of guy. But it's interesting that the point in the puzzle where psychiatry rubs up against osteopathy, it's a really interesting area, and that's what Phil was exploring in his book, The Muscular Manifesto, and in those papers that he wrote, which I think I often, when I do postgraduate workshops, I often say to people, you should go and get Phil Leahy's stuff and read it, because there's some really good content in there.
So now, also in my exploration of Clive Standen on the internet, looking you up, I found that the two sort of groups of patients you're particularly interested in are at either end of the age spectrum. So you've got a strong interest in infants and babies and children, and then at the other end with elderly patients as well. How do those interests develop for you?
I just found that for some reason I was reminded by somebody who used to teach with me that a long time ago she stopped teaching to have children and brought the first one back. As you do, you go back and see your colleagues. She came to the BSO when we were on a break during a first year technique class, which she taught with myself and Adrian Barnes and David Tatton. And she'd got this child with her, and it was only years later she said, "Do you remember what happened?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Well, he was a really grumpy, grouchy baby, and he started crying while we were all having coffee. So she said, 'You have him.' And I think I'd got a I don't know, 2-year-old or 1-year-old or something at the time.
Yeah.
And I wandered around with this child who went off to sleep, and she came back a week or two later and said, "What did you do?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Oh, he's been better since you worked on him, or since you." And I apart from dealing with my own children, I tried to avoid contact with babies.
Yes.
As a fairly tall, scary person, I didn't, dealing with small children didn't necessarily fit easily with me.
Yeah.
But then I just found that I didn't find it too difficult working with small children, and it just became something that I got interested in. I don't do so much of it now. I do still do it occasionally. And I've had some really interesting experiences working with small children. I think elderly people, as I mentioned before, some of the quote unquote old people I met when I was quite young, I remember talking to people who fought in the trenches, or people who'd had experiences right at the beginning of the last century in the early 1900s. And so I kind of found that they often had some very interesting things to talk about. I think also I've dealt with elderly people who a recurring comment has been, "Thank you so much for listening to me."
Yes.
And I think listening skills are one of the most important things an osteopath can develop. But I think it's in the nature of our society. Elderly people, it's a bit of a truism, but I think it's a reasonable thing to say that elderly people are often not listened to.
Yes, we've lost that kind of elders phenomenon, which you would find in more indigenous cultures, where the elders are the wise people, and they seem to be more discarded, retired, past the sell-by date. Is the kind of sentiment that seems to be more prevalent in our society.
And interestingly, another element of things that has changed is when I started, we would often see people in the 70s who said, "I've been everywhere else and nobody wants to do anything. You're my last resort, you osteopaths, not you, me personally." And so there was a willingness in those days to tackle quite weird things. You would take things on because other people would say, "No, there's nothing we can do." And then that faded away a bit for a while. But strangely, it's come back again. It's like in an algorithm-based society, people who don't fit an algorithm rock up to see the osteopath and say, "Well, I've got this and this and this. Who have you been to?" "I've been here, 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 and here." None of them. They all say they can't do anything.
So as a kind of outlying profession, we end up seeing outlying patients.
I think my experience is that that's happened more again. And talking to colleagues in England, and I frequently now encounter people, "I've got this problem and this problem. Who have you been to?" And what did they say? They say they can't treat it. And have they given you any suggestions about what to do? No. And the lack of one of my friends over there calls it clinical curiosity. You know, what this is a weird problem. What do you think it is? I don't know. Well, what do you think I should do? I don't know. Oh, okay then. That's $200. Thanks very much. Goodbye.
Yes. Yeah.
Patients say to me they find it intensely frustrating that they go through a little roster of specialists and come out at the other end poorer and no better. And so I think osteopaths with a pragmatic, problem-solving, empirical approach can help people to, you know, get through their activities of daily living better.
Yes.
An elderly lady said to me a long time ago, I said, "How are you doing?" She said, it's still there, but I can get to the bus stop now.
Right.
And I can go into town and I can meet my old workmates for coffee and I can get the bus home. And that's a huge improvement.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was quite an eye-opener. I thought, okay, so what you really, you know, and it's as Basil Fawlty would say, it's bleeding obvious, isn't it? What people want is not to be totally pain-free. They would like that, but the first thing they want is to be able to do what they want to do.
Yeah, of course.
And so I think with elderly people, one of the things I enjoy is saying, well, look, you know, if you want to go for a walk, go for a walk. And that can be quite transformational.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So how about your Hold My Hand business? Is that something that you're still, because I think the website's still active, but you set that up in 2012.
It's still there. It was really something to do. And I kind of liked the idea. I never really pushed it anywhere. But I do like the image that what people want is, you know, it's like a small child will say, oh, I don't want to do that. And you say to them, well, I'll come with you. I'll hold your hand.
Yeah.
And the notion, the image of somebody being a hand holder quietly in the background, I still like. I think just after I set that up, I started doing the Chinese medicine thing,
right? Yeah.
And then the naturopathy thing, and it faded away. And in fact, one of the things I need to do is to renew the website.
Right. Yeah. But I saw you had your wife was involved as well. What's her background?
Yeah. She was, at that time, she was a gynecology nurse. She was working as she worked for the local health board. She was running an early pregnancy clinic. So she was dealing with people having miscarriages and pregnancy problems. And again, her interest, one of her interests was people who are medicalized, and Stephen Timon, many years ago now, pointed me to the videos online of Kieran Sweeney. It was on a BMJ website, I think. Kieran Sweeney was I think he was a professor of general practice at the Peninsula Medical School down in the southwest of England. And he was a GP. And there's a very moving interview with him online in which he describes being diagnosed with mesothelioma. And he talks about the fact that none of his colleagues could look him in the eye and nobody really dealt with him as, and he used this phrase of being somebody at the edge of the human predicament. And he said all of the care all of the treatment I received was technically first class, but as a person, he felt, I think he does use the word abandoned.
Marginalized.
That he had, he had to go through what he went through. And how hard it was.
Yeah, I've seen.
And I think
videos.
both my wife and I are aware that people go through things like miscarriages, and get, they drop off the conveyor belt, having received very good technical treatment, but somehow not having felt cared for.
Yeah.
And we live in an increasingly target-driven society, where people have to do so many transactions a day to meet their targets for whichever organization they work for.
Yes.
And so it can become hugely problematic for the patient who still wants their story to be heard and to be able to make sense of it for themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I think that's what the Hold My Hand thing was about, that you may just want somebody to bounce this off and help you make sense of it, not to make sense of it for you or to tell you what it is or whatever.
Yeah.
And that, I think that it's a strange thing. We live in a hugely connected world in which it's much easier to communicate, but those problems are ongoing. And
yes, yeah, for sure.
I think osteopaths have a lot to do, a lot to contribute.
Yeah, definitely. So what does the future hold for you now? Are you winding the practice down, or are you still going all guns blazing? Or
no, I work for two other people.
Yeah.
I do a Monday and a Friday in one clinic, and a sort of a short Wednesday in another one. And I do stuff. We have a system. People come into New Zealand from the UK. It's called a competent authority pathway, and they work under the kind of distant guidance of a preceptor. They have to go through a set process to make sure they understand the law here, and that they practice in a way that is consistent with what the council requires. So I do some of that, and I do other bits and pieces of online consultancy for people. People talk to me sometimes about curriculum design or those sorts of things.
Right.
I heard a guy on the radio saying that he was trying to manage his retirement by doing 2 days of earning, 2 days of learning, and keeping 3 days for himself. And that seemed to me to be a really good kind of guideline, that you spend some time making a bit of money, sometime doing something that makes your brain work, and then doing stuff like walking the dog, which I need to be doing soon.
Yes, I was going to say, absolutely. Your young puppy is crossing his legs.
He's asleep under the chair. But I think it's not necessarily a smart thing to stop working abruptly. And I think it's, like I said to you right at the beginning, osteopathy is a peculiar combination of mental and physical activity. And I think that's why I think it's a good thing to keep doing, not indefinitely, but all the while people come and say, I feel really good since that treatment. I think, okay, we'll just keep going a little bit longer.
Absolutely, yeah, fantastic.
Yeah.
So, Clive, if you had any advice for a young person, perhaps considering a career in osteopathy, or perhaps they've started their career, they're doing their training, what advice would you offer them? Because if you recall, the podcast is called From Chaos to Order, so we're trying to make some sense of all the confusion that's out there. What would be your kind of simplicity that you would offer them?
I think it's trying to find people who will talk honestly with you. Just before we started talking, I caught the end of a BBC World Service programme about the the nature of arguments, and the guy was saying one of his pieces of advice for how to argue, as in kind of explore something, was don't assume you know what someone else means. And so to try to find people who you can talk to who won't assume you're an idiot if you say you don't know. I think saying you don't know is really important. And I don't want to be controversial, but osteopathy is a profession in which it's too easy to bluff. And so I think if you're a young person starting out, find somebody with more experience who is not gonna bullshit with oh well, you'll understand that after another 10 years. Somebody who's prepared to put time in to listen to you, and that you can listen to them. You know. Phil Leahy used to say, when he was working in Notting Hill prior to his departure for Australia, he used to, in the morning, he used to see what he would describe as, you know, the basic bread and butter osteopathic patients. And he'd do 4 hours of that, and then he'd have a long lunch break. And he would see them for 20 or 30 minutes. So he'd do a kind of a normal list, and then in the afternoon he'd book difficult patients for an hour each. So that he could really spend time talking to them and listening to them, talking with them, and spend time dealing with them. When I did a cranial course with Rollin Becker, I did 2 cranial courses with Rollin Becker, but he said to people, don't abandon everything you've been taught. Just choose 1 or 2 patients a day to try things with and talk to them about what you're doing. And so that kind of good communication, I think, it's a crucial thing. Which is why things like good podcasts are really useful. Finding people that you can talk to who will share, like I said, I'm repeating myself now, people who will honestly share experiences and listen.
Fantastic.
That would be the thing. And you know, like I said before, just have a go. Really have a go, and make good notes. That's the other thing.
Make good notes. That's a good tip.
Make good notes.
Definitely.
Yeah, make good notes. And if you have a really even if you just put something in the notes that said had meaningful conversation with patient, you don't have to write down what it was. It can be really useful to, if you do ever have to go back and look at your notes, to remember that there was something in the interaction that was significant.
For sure. Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, so if people want to get hold of you, Clive, where would be best to do that? Should they look you up online, or should we share?
That's the best thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Email's good. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay. Well,
I'm really happy to. I do get people from different countries contacting me to say, "What do you think about this?" or "What do you think about that?" Which is nice. Very flattering when that happens.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think the hold my hand thing, I know you said that you didn't push it, but I think it's such a fantastic offering that's there. Would you still be willing to offer that kind of mentorship?
Absolutely, yeah. And I will talk to my web guy, and we'll go and have a look at reinvigorating it, I think.
Excellent.
And in fact, it's probably, in terms of FaceTime and Zencaster and all the other softwares, it's easier to do it now than it would have been,
of course,
when I started.
It's fantastic, isn't it? Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for your time. I was going to finish off with a quote, which I don't know if you know this, but the first time I saw Kim Kaur, because you mentioned Kim Kaur or Evan Kaur earlier in the discussion, and the first time I saw him speak, he actually opened with this, and he said, "What do an osteopath and a proctologist have in common?" I don't know if you know the answer to that. Do you know the answer?
I've heard him say that, yeah.
Well, I'll remind you, he says that they both see the body as a whole.
That's right.
There you go. It's a good concluding note.
You know the story about he was a very good violinist. You know that story?
No, I don't know that one, no.
Brian Dagenhart tells this story about when he was at Princeton.
Yeah.
He played in a string quartet, and he played first violin.
Okay.
And the guy who played second violin was a physicist who was at Princeton at the same time, a guy called Einstein.
Right.
And so Brian likes to say that Einstein played second fiddle to Core.
Brilliant. I love that. That's very good. Yeah. I'm sure Core like that as well.
Oh yeah, I think so. Yeah. And if you ever met Kim Core and shook hands with him, it means you're just one handshake away from Einstein.
Yeah, amazing. Amazing. Wow.
Yeah. Good stuff.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thanks so much for your time again. And hopefully our paths will cross soon. I'm out with you, or at least in your neck of the woods, in March. So fingers crossed. Okay. We will cross paths.
Look forward to it.
Yeah, fantastic.
Cheers.
So there was an in-depth journey through the life of Clive and his experiences in shaping the osteopathic profession here in the UK and around the world. Whenever you meet with someone with so much experience in this field, you inevitably meet with much wisdom, which I hope you enjoyed. In the next episode, we have my Czech colleague, Jator Pierre, where we dive deep into an array of topics, as those of you who know Jator will not be surprised by. From his work with the Czech Institute, with Chris Kresser, and his own inimitable, raw honesty approach to emotional coaching, there's plenty of juice, philosophy, and sustenance there for the most inquiring of minds. Thanks for joining us again today. See you on the next show.